Are you new to photography and you're looking to get out of auto mode and into manual mode, but you don't really know where to start? Well, in order to do that, you need to have a good understanding of the exposure triangle. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. So stick around. I've got you covered. Hey everyone, it's Lee from Lee Squire Photography. I'm a wedding and portrait photographer, and I've actually been doing this professionally for over 6 years now. Today, my goal is to help you understand how to shoot in manual mode and how to understand the exposure triangle. So as you know, photography is all about light. And when it comes down to the exposure triangle, it's the way that we can control the light entering into our camera. Now, having full understanding and mastery of the exposure triangle is really what sets apart a beginner photographer from a professional photographer. And so that's why I wanted to cover this topic today, because obviously you need somewhere to start. Now, the exposure triangle is really comprised of 3 settings that you'll find on your camera, and together they're going to help you get that correct exposure when taking a photograph. Now, these 3 settings are ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. Now, ISO represents your camera's sensitivity to light. Aperture is the amount of light that your lens lets into your camera. And shutter speed is how quickly the shutter opens and closes on your camera to let light into your camera. Now, let's talk about how each of these settings will affect the photographs that you... So let's start with ISO. ISO affects how sensitive your camera is to light. And so the lower the number, the less sensitive, and the higher the number, the more sensitive your camera is to light. So the lower number, the sharper and more clean your photos are going to be. But there is a catch depending on the capabilities of your camera. And really, for every camera, there is a limit. But if you go too high with your ISO, it will introduce what we call noise into your photographs. And the results will be a lower quality image that looks grainy and muddy. Next is shutter speed. Now, shutter speed is how quickly the shutter is opening and closing to let light into your camera. So the slower the shutter speed, the more light is let into your camera. And the faster the shutter speed, the less light is being let into your camera. In addition to that, if your shutter speed is too low when photographing and there's too much movement, you'll introduce what we call motion blur into your photograph. So if you have people moving a lot, this is not something that you'll want. Now, if you're photographing people, this is typically not something that you'll want unless you do it deliberately in order to create that movement or sense of interest in your shot. If your shutter speed is much higher, then you'll not have motion blur and it will actually freeze any movement in your frame. So whether you're capturing someone running or a vehicle driving by, etc., it will be frozen in the frame. Hey there, now I just want to pause really quick. If you're finding value in this video, please go ahead and hit the like button. And also, if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button for more videos on photography tips, gear, and things like that. Now back to the video. And now for my favorite, which is aperture. I like you to think about aperture sort of how you would think about the iris of your eyes. Now, the larger the iris is of your eye, the more light is being let in, and the smaller the iris, the less light is being let in. So the lower the f-stop number of your lens, so let's say 1.2 or f1.2 or f1.8, that's a very low f-stop number. That's going to let in more light into your camera. And the more open these aperture blades are on your lens it's going to bring in, again, more light. Now, the higher the f-stop, the less light is going to be brought into your camera. So that iris is going to be a lot smaller. Now, one of the other great things about aperture is that it determines the depth of field in your photographs. So the lower your aperture, the more blurry the background is going to be in your photographs. And the higher the f-stop or the higher the aperture number, the more in focus everything in your photograph will be. Now, if we pull everything we just talked about together, the goal of using the exposure triangle is to use each of these settings or elements in order to properly expose your photograph. So you have a properly lit photograph. Now, in addition to this, you'll need to also think about how each setting is going to impact the end result of the photograph that you're taking. And it really just depends on the look that you're going for as well. So now that we've covered that, let's talk about where you want to start when you enter a scene or when you get on location for a photo shoot, or if you're about to take pictures. Now, what I typically like to do is set my ISO for the scene. And I set ISO first in order to ensure that I can get the cleanest possible image depending on the light available. And even if the other two settings are to my liking, if ISO is too high, then that can ruin the image or give me a lower quality image because of the grain that we talked about that can be introduced into your photograph. So for instance, if I'm outside and it's full sun, there's no clouds, it's beautiful outside, lots of sunlight, I'm probably going to start with my ISO at around 100. And I will want my camera to be, less sensitive to light, right? Because there's so much light available. That's why my ISO will be so low at 100. Now, if I'm indoors, I will want to raise my ISO level to a level that looks good to me. So if I'm indoors, I might raise my ISO to maybe 400 to 500 or 600. It really depends on what looks good and what the appropriate level is indoors. But again, you will want your camera to be a little bit more sensitive to light, right? Let a little bit more light into your camera because it's not super bright and sunny. Does that make sense? Now, however, this is where you need to start to think about the capabilities of your camera, which you'll learn over time. Each camera has a certain level of ISO that you probably won't want to go past if you can help it, because you don't want to introduce any grain or noise into your images. So next, after that, I usually adjust my aperture. When adjusting my aperture, I'm generally thinking about the style of the photo that I want to capture. If I'm going for a photograph that has a nice creamy blurry background, then I want to use the lowest f-stop number available for my lens. So for instance, that 1.2, 1.8, etc. If I'm photographing a group of people, then I know that I might need to increase my f-stop number just a little bit to ensure that everyone is in focus. Because if I'm focusing on one person and there are multiple people in the photograph, the person I'm focusing on is going to be very sharp, but the people behind them or nearby are going to be blurry. And so that's why you will want to increase that f-stop number to maybe an f4, for instance, to ensure that more people are in focus in that photograph. Now, in general, based on the way that I typically like to shoot, I usually like to have my f-stop as wide open as possible to have that beautiful creamy background. So again, my f-stop number is going to be as low as possible, maybe f1.2, f.8 to get that nice, beautiful background. Now, finally, I adjust my shutter speed, and because I'm photographing people during portrait sessions and weddings, I generally would like to capture people maybe around 1/200 of a second. And that way I can ensure that I'm freezing my subjects in the frame. And there are times where I might want a more stylistic photograph where I want to capture a bit of motion blur into the shot. And for these more stylistic opportunities, then I might lower my shutter speed just enough to capture a little bit of motion blur in the photograph. And this is something that you can play around with over time to learn what those shutter speeds might look like with a certain amount of motion in the photograph. The one thing that I also want you to keep in mind is that when it comes down to shutter speed, in order to make sure the shutter speed is high enough to capture the amount of motion in your photograph, take into consideration that the lower you go, the more opportunity that you introduce for blurry photographs that might be a result of you actually holding the camera itself. So that hand holding can sometimes introduce a little bit of motion blur. Now, you may be wondering at this point why it's called the exposure triangle. And one of the things that you want to keep in mind is that you'll want to keep all of your settings balanced. And so that exposure triangle should definitely be balanced. If you make changes to one setting, you will need to make changes or adjustments to other settings in order to balance out the light or to balance your photograph to have that correct exposure. Now, if you're someone that's going from auto mode to manual mode, this is definitely something that you will want to practice. And you can practice just about anywhere. You can practice inside the house. You can practice outdoors. You can use different objects around the house. You can use your pets. You can use people in your home if you want to as well. But the more that you practice, the better you'll understand how the exposure triangle works and the more comfortable you'll be in finding the correct settings depending on your environment. Now, if you found value in this video, please go ahead and hit the like button. And if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button with the notification bell to be alerted every time I produce a video about photography tips and gear and things like that. I typically like to put out videos at least once a week as well, so stay tuned and look out for that next video. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.